your name and the league with which you're affiliated. If you want to access the chat function, it's in the bottom bar of Zoom, or you might have to click the three dots for more to see it. And then if you want to speak during the meeting, you can either use the reactions in Zoom to raise your hand or put a capital R in the chat box to be recognized. A quick reminder, only delegates may vote. So if you are an observer, you can just close the polls and everything. Motions and seconds should be made both verbally and put in the chat for posterity and record keeping. And I think that's it. Back to you, Karen. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Laura. All right. So we are going to kind of skip over the Credentialing Committee report at this time since our speaker is here. And it is my great pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker, Ambassador Gary Grappo, who will be offering his perspective on confronting authoritarianism in the 21st century. Ambassador Grappo is a former U.S. ambassador and currently a distinguished fellow at the Center for Middle Studies at the Korbel School for International Studies, University of Denver. As a career member of the Senior Foreign Service of the U.S. Department of State, he has received numerous State Department awards, including the 2009 Senior Foreign Service Presidential Award for his service as Chief of Mission in Oman. During his Foreign Service career, he has had numerous assignments at the State Department and numerous postings in such countries as Jordan, Saudi Arabia, and Iraq. He currently provides analysis, guidance, and advice on foreign affairs and national security issues, writing and speaking frequently on Middle East affairs and foreign policy. And we are very pleased to have you join us this morning, Ambassador Grappo, and we look forward to your comments on the threat of authoritarianism to democracy. So I would like to turn the program over to you.
Well, thank you very much for your kind introduction, and hello to everyone. What must be a very chilly morning in late May in Denver. I am not in Denver at the moment. I hesitate to share with you where I am because actually the weather is quite pleasant where I happen to be at the moment. But I will say that it's a pleasure to be speaking about a topic on which I worked for a considerable period of time during my time in the Foreign Service and in the State Department. I spent a lot of time working on the democracy account, very broadly speaking, including everything from human rights to women's rights, free speech, free and open media, working on elections in a number of countries, and so on and so forth. So I feel like I have some fair amount of hands-on experience when it comes to promoting democracy. What I will say, and I'll be very honest about this, is that U.S. efforts to promote and advance democracy abroad have been pretty fitful. In some administrations, they've been very strong. In others, not as strong, I will put it that way. And if you look at the results, even a bit more sketchy. It's very, very difficult to promote democracy abroad. Probably our greatest successes came at the end of the Cold War when we had so many countries in Eastern Europe which desperately wanted to open up their nations, their societies, their economies to democracy, to free enterprise, and so forth. Many of those proved to be extraordinarily successful. Since then, however, the record has not been quite as bright, unfortunately. And so in my discussion here this evening, or this afternoon, my time, I'll be talking a little bit about how we go about today, given what we have learned from the experience of the last 20 to 25 years in trying to confront authoritarianism and promote and advance democracy abroad. But let's first of all take stock of where we stand today. in terms of democracies around the world, and it's not an encouraging picture right now. There are several institutions that spend a fair amount of time studying democracies and how democracies are progressing around the world. And so I draw most of my information not only from my own experience, but from the Economist Intelligence Unit, Freedom House, and a project known as the Varieties of Democracy. Those three publish extensive reports and data about democracy around the world. So that's where I get most of my data. And today, in terms of full democracies, in the way we mostly understand it in terms of respect for the rights of the individual, including women and minorities, justice, freedom of speech, and open media, free, fair, transparent elections, efforts to constrain and minimize corruption, and respect religious freedom. There are only about 21 countries around the world that today meet the criteria for a full democracy. Sadly, the United States is not among those. As of 2017, the United States was downgraded into the next category, which is a flawed democracy, of which today there are about 53 countries. So if we add those two numbers up, they represent about almost 37% of the world's population. The rest of the world's population lives in either a hybrid democracy or an authoritarian state. In fact, the largest category is an authoritarian state in which 37% of the world's population unfortunately find themselves. In 2021, 60 countries registered a decline in their democracy rating. The United States was one of those. In fact, if you look at where we stand today, we are probably at the same level we were, speaking worldwide, that we were in 1989, 2 years before the end of the Cold War. It's probably the grimmest moment since the end of the Cold War in terms of democracy around the world. Only about 34 countries today can be described as full-fledged liberal democracies. The United States still falls into that category, but it's being challenged. But if we look at where we were back in 2012, when it sort of peaked, we've lost 8 countries. So the general picture of democracy around the world is not a bright one. And so let's look at some of the causes for that, the challenges that the United States in particular faces as the world's, I want to say, largest democracy. We're not quite India, although it's categorized as an even more flawed democracy than ourselves, is still the world's largest democracy. And that's because worldwide, we are battling on 2 fronts, so to speak. The first is trying to prevent a backsliding of established democracies. And we know which countries that these are. You've heard or read about them. They're often reported about in the media. These are countries like India, Hungary, Poland, Turkey, the Philippines, Brazil, Mexico, and of course, the United States. It's probably the most, it's probably the best example of a backsliding democracy today. And that's a real challenge because many of the leaders, in fact, all the leaders of the countries I just named were democratically elected in free and fair elections, such as it is. But typically what happens in each of those countries is that once the leader is elected, that person begins to work within the system to alter the Constitution or the electoral process in order to ensure that that person remains, or that party remains in power. That's exactly what happened with Vladimir Putin when he first came to power in 1999. And since then, he has taken progressive steps to ensure he remains in power. I think currently it's until the year 2034, 2036, something like that. Viktor Orban in Hungary has done the same thing. And so that in the case of Hungary, which just had its elections for president, his party is able to control the parliament of Hungary, even though it only earned 45% of the popular vote. Opposition parties won 55% of the vote and have only about a third of the Hungarian parliament. And that's due to the changes that have been engineered by Orban and his party. And these sorts of things have happened. Erdogan in Turkey has done very similar things. It's not unusual that these democracies, which were not some of the strongest democracies around, were not able to install the necessary checks and balances to ensure that power is constrained. And if we reflect on our own country, our founding fathers, at least at the beginning, did a pretty good job of establishing the checks and balances necessary to ensure that excesses of power were very, very limited, although those means are being tested certainly today. So the one challenge that we face is sort of a rear guard campaign to protect existing democracies and ensure their continuance and their strength. But the larger campaign, of course, and a more proactive one, is to spur the growth of more democracies overseas. And this is where our progress of late has not been very good at all. And there are a variety of reasons for that, particularly when it comes to what the United States does to advance democracy. One of the inherent challenges that we face in our country, and certainly I dealt with it in my own personal experience, is that our political system is geared to the short term. And so, for example, in a particular democracy promotion program that the State Department or USAID may want to launch, we'll have to go up to Congress and explain the program. And one of the first things they're going to want to know is, how soon can you have elections? Well, elections usually are the last thing in a successful democracy. Typically, you want to take care of all the prerequisites for a democracy before you move on to elections. And so unfortunately, we have seen, in a case of ourselves and some of our democracy programming, pushing elections in countries where they really weren't necessary. And there are multiple examples of these. I mean, Iraq was a classic case, Afghanistan, even in Tunisia, which had been one of the great success stories of the Arab Spring. Unfortunately, they have suffered serious backsliding over the course of the last year. But pushing these countries into elections when perhaps they weren't quite ready, and that the building blocks for a functioning democracy weren't quite in place. And we are really hobbled in the system that we have here, because Congress works on a very short-term annual budgets, and they want to see results. And typically the results that sell for any member deciding to run again is, I supported Program X because it gave us free and fair elections in country Y. And they want to be able to say that as soon as they can. And I can't tell you the number of times I would have to explain to members of Congress or to their staffs, look, we're not sure that we can do this in 5 years. Forget about next year. And once we get to that point, then they become a little shaky. Well, then why should we be doing this? We want to start with the building blocks. We know that if the building blocks are there, then the superstructure you want to build for a functioning democracy can actually be put into place. A second challenge that we have faced is that, as I mentioned earlier, the political support for democracy programming in our government has been pretty fitful from administration to administration. And it's not always a function of which party happens to be in the White House or controlling Congress. President Bush, for example, this is Bush 43, was a very strong advocate of democracy programming. Didn't quite start out that way, but he did become that way. But Bill Clinton before him was also a very strong advocate of democracy programming. Bush 41, somewhat, not as strongly as others. Jimmy Carter was probably the first to really put himself out there, focusing in particular on human rights. So there is that challenge, but what really sort of put a stick in the spokes of our democracy programming was the election of Mr. Trump. And we saw a pretty steep decline in democracy programming around the world, and also related programs that had to deal with either women's empowerment, human rights, minority protection, not so much on religious freedom if you were talking about Christians, but if you were talking about Muslims, for example, the Rohingya in Myanmar, not a lot of interest. And so this is the kind of fitful programming that we have seen, and really hobbles those in government who try to advance democracy around the world, and actually spend their careers very often in promoting democracy. I should also add that it's not just individuals, government officials, the State Department, USAID, and so forth. We, the United States, rely on a quite wide range of NGOs to carry out our democracy program. We will work with them in designing specific programs to meet the unique needs of the countries where these programs take place. So what we might support, for example, in India or in Egypt, may be very, very different from what we do in Indonesia or Brazil. And it really varies from country to country. And that sort of expertise sometimes doesn't always reside inside the US government. We'll look to the various nonprofit NGOs in the United States. We rely, for the most part, on American NGOs to do this for us, and we'll work hand in hand with them to do this programming. And very often, they'll carry the lion's share of the load in some of these countries with using their experts. So the whole question of where the United States stands when it comes to democracy is really weighing down efforts even today under the administration of Joe Biden. Countries around the world, people have seen the ups and downs of US support for democracy and are therefore a little hesitant to sign on when they can't be sure that 5 years down the road, the United States is going to be there to continue to support whatever effort they've undertaken. But probably the biggest challenge that we are facing today in our democracy programming is authoritarianism, and particularly this notion of authoritarian capitalism that's being advanced by China. China has activated a very successful model. They have registered astonishing growth over the last 20, 25 years. And for many developing countries around the world, they see this and they want to emulate that. And China has very astutely, wisely taken advantage of it. They don't impose any constraints the way we do on their economic support funding in terms of human rights or democracy, respect for minorities or women or anything like that. They pretty much tie it to strictly economic needs. And those countries which are not democracies are more than happy to accept that in order to show that they can be, quote, progressive too, unquote. Progressive meaning perhaps improving the standard of living in those countries with various economic projects, but really not doing much to promote the individual rights of the people in those countries. China spends no time or effort whatsoever, and in fact, shies away from that. And in many, many cases, actually works against it. It's a Belt and Road Initiative, for example, which it uses to promote economic development around the world, and a lot of Chinese economic interests as well, has no strings attached when it comes to human rights or democracy or protection of women and minorities and all these sorts of things that we have to look at as part of our funding, whether it's democracy funding or even military support. Very often there are waivers, of course, built into ours for those allies and friends of ours who are not democracies, of whom there are quite a few. So the Chinese model is very seductive these days. And in light of the challenges that democracies have faced around the world, particularly here in our own country, but also Europe and elsewhere, many countries are finding this a very attractive model. And the democratic capitalist model is too messy, too hard, too challenging, particularly if you're the person in power or the party in power. Why mess with that? If you can meet the economic needs of your population, chances are you're not going to go anywhere and they'll be happy to leave you where you are. And very often that is the case. And then finally, it's the circumstances in which we live today that present enormous challenges for existing democracies as well as democracies that are evolving. And I'm talking about the many economic stresses that the world has been put through over the last 10 or 15 years, from the financial crisis of 2008 and 9 to the more recent economic stresses brought on by COVID, and then of course COVID itself, and then all the changes wrought by advancing technology, and particularly as it applies to cyber warfare and information manipulation or disinformation. All of these are creating enormous stresses for societies around the world. In the area where I spent most of my Foreign Service career in the Middle East, one of the things that has really exacerbated conditions there was when communications became effectively free and open, even though governments up until about the late 1990s, early 2000s had done a very good job of controlling the media. They could no longer do it. With the advent of satellite television and the internet, social media, it was an impossible task. They still try to do it, and they're still quite active in doing it. But once they did this, there was this information deluge. And for societies unaccustomed to evaluating information, what's true and what's not, we face that challenge here in our own country. It became very problematic. And sometimes it was very simple and almost easy to turn to the government. Well, we'll just go along with what the government is saying here. And it's a very simple and easy cop-out because it's tough to digest all the information in the world today, much less that which applies to you or even deciding which information applies to you. And this has put enormous stress on societies, particularly lesser developed societies, which may not have the education or sophistication to comprehend the information that's being presented to them. And so this greatly complicates the task of not only promoting democracy around the world, but preserving democracies around the world. And this is what we're having to contend with. So how should perhaps the United States and other countries who are in the quote democracy game, there are not many of us, by the way, there are a handful that we have been able to turn to do the programs that we do. And when I say we, I mean the United States, Great Britain, Canada, France, Germany, and to a limited extent, Japan and Australia. And you're probably right, you have a few others, some of the Scandinavian countries, though their resources are fairly scant, so it's limited in what they can do. And there are other European countries, but it's very limited. The ones that I named are the ones who have devoted, relatively speaking, significant amount of resources to doing democracy promotion around the world. What should we all be doing and how should we be doing it? And there's one thing I've learned from my own experience is you need a very heavy dose of humility. Sometimes, and I have to plead guilty to this myself, we go in with this notion of democracy has all the answers. No, we don't. We don't. We can see it in our own country. And it would be wrong to assert that democracy gives you all the answers. It does not. It provides a system for helping societies find answers to the challenges they confront. And it's been proven over the long term to be far more effective than authoritarian societies. But democracy itself, and I think this is the shock that has come to some of the countries of Eastern Europe and even in countries of the Middle East that strongly moved toward what looked to be democracies during that the halcyon period of the Arab Spring, have now discovered, no, just because you proclaim yourself to be a democracy and have elections does not necessarily mean automatic boost in GDP for the next 20 years. No, it's not going to happen. But it does give you the wherewithal for societies to come together, to work together, to find solutions to problems. So we need to be humble about that. And this is a hard message to deliver, because humans are humans, and we do look for easy solutions to our problems. One of the other things is that here in the United States, which until very recently was seen as the model democracy, we are finding that we have a lot of holes. And these are noted by societies around the world. And these are well known to us, but other countries around the world have taken note too. There was, of course, the presidency of Donald Trump. There is the persistence of racism in our country, violence and the prevalence of guns in this country. This is something that, with the exception of a handful of countries, is not understood by many, many countries around the world. The political gridlock in our country, the inability, for example, of our legislature to get a lot of the necessary work done that it needs to do. Our very lax, ineffective response to the COVID crisis, the growing disparity in incomes in our country, which is getting worse, the extreme polarization in our society, in our media, and finally, the wars that the United States undertook in places like Iraq and Afghanistan. All of these have really contributed to severe blemishing of the United States as a model democracy, which we were seen as being throughout the 90s and the early 2000s. Now some of these things were always there. The racism, some of the violence and the prevalence of guns. The income disparity wasn't quite as bad, but it was growing. These have always been there, but now they're quite pronounced, and I don't think anyone can ignore them. And people see these for what they are, and therefore to tout the United States as a democracy when we confront our own very serious challenges is really difficult. And now I'm not saying that we shouldn't shy from promoting democracy, but we just need to acknowledge that we ourselves are a very imperfect democracy, a flawed democracy, if you want to put it in the jargon that's used today. I think we also have to understand that advancing democracy anywhere, including in our own country, is always going to be long-term. I tell many of my students that the natural order in human existence has not been democracy. It's been authoritarianism. You can probably count one, maybe two hands, the successful experiments with democracy in human history. We all know about the constrained experiments that were undertaken in places like Greece or in Rome. Those today would probably be characterized as, at best, flawed and probably hybrid democracies. There is the Venetian Republic, which existed for a period of about 1,000 years. It was very small, but it was a democracy, albeit a flawed democracy. It was run by an oligarchy, but it did enjoy, for the most part during its history, popular support. But throughout human history, the natural order of things has generally been authoritarianism. So in many ways, in trying to advance democracy, we are swimming against the tide of human history. We just have to acknowledge that. It's very, very difficult to do democracy as we defined it. And so therefore, when we promote democracy, I think starting out very modestly and getting countries to look at some of the foundational components of a democracy. For example, and this has particular relevance today, the non-use of force in altering borders and non-intervention in the affairs of other countries. Now, the United Nations does acknowledge the right, the obligation of the United Nations to intervene into the affairs of a country under certain circumstances, but they really have to be limited. For the most part, it enshrines the concept non-intervention, which was first established in the middle of the 17th century after the 30 Years' War. This was in the Peace of Westphalia, negotiated around 1649, 1650, something like that. So starting out with something very modest like that, the sanctity of borders and of the sovereignty of nations. If we could get all countries to truly embrace that, we'd be making some progress. We haven't done that. And the most obvious case of Russian invasion of Ukraine is a clear example. But even in the case of the US invasion of Iraq in 2003, there's another good case in point. Now, at the time, obviously, the US administration thought it had a strong rationale. I and many others would differ with that, but they tried to make the argument, which was subsequently proven wrong. And therefore, maybe it is wise from our own perspective to begin looking at this concept of sovereign borders. And then from that, begin to build on certain other building blocks in establishing democracies, looking at civil society institutions like the League of Women Voters, for example, and in others, looking at the rule of law, justice systems, building effective justice systems that protect individual rights, and reaching some common understanding of what basic human rights are. Now, we do have the UN Charter for Human Rights. It's amazing how many countries have signed on to that and then proceed to violate it. There are probably more violators of that Human Rights Convention than there are those who respect it. And so starting with those basic concepts might be a useful way to go. One of the things that I have tried to focus on in the latter years of my career when I got involved in democracy promotion is civil society institutions, and starting at the local level, particularly in authoritarian societies that provide for some space for local governance to try and make that local governance as effective as it can be, and targeting those places for the kind of assistance and training that we might be able to give them. And we have done that successfully in a few places, but again, it's been fitful. Very often, we're pressed to accelerate our programming, and we move too quickly, and things begin to fall behind. So in some of these areas, I really believe that if we take a modest, slow, long-term approach, and we also have to recognize, and this is particularly important given the diversity around the world, but recognize the importance of culture, language, history, geographic origins, and religion in societies. All of these play a critical role. And in the advancement of democracy or just good governance in general in any country, if you fail to acknowledge those and incorporate those in some fashion into how you advance responsible governance, you're going to fail. You're simply going to fail. And probably the clearest example of that is in confronting the challenge of immigration, which countries, which developed countries around the world are now facing, particularly in Europe, but certainly in our own country as well. How do we deal with increasing numbers of immigrants to a country, many times coming from countries that have no background whatsoever in democratic rule? They come from radically different cultures and languages, very often religions. And so how do societies cope with the challenge of immigration? Unfortunately, Europe wasn't the best example. We saw what happened with the Brexit vote, and that was driven in significant part as a reaction to the immigration crisis that Europe faced in 2010, 2012, and even before. So looking at culture, language, religion, and so forth in our democracy programming is something that's going to be increasingly important. I don't think we paid enough attention to it in the past. There may have been efforts to, but it was always met with, well, look, democracy will work anywhere. It's a system that embraces all religions, all people. Well, perhaps in theory, at a higher level, that's true, but in its application, you simply cannot afford to neglect these factors. And I think, particularly in the programming that we have undertaken, we have sometimes ignored that. So these are the things that I think we should begin to incorporate in our democracy program to make it more effective. But probably the biggest challenge that we're going to face, excuse me, in our own country is finding a consensus on how the United States and whether the United States should promote democracy overseas. Democracy is being challenged right here at home. You have some US politicians who now believe that democracy is the road to perdition and that we need some other system. I think this is anomalous in our country, but there are some who are beginning to talk that way. And so coming to a common understanding, which is going to be very difficult given the partisan divide in our legislative system, of what should the United States be doing, if anything, to promote democracy abroad, particularly since we see this waning of democracy in established countries, established democratic countries around the world, and we see the growing strength of non-democracies in other places around the world, particularly when it's being actively challenged by countries like China and Russia, Iran, and North Korea. Probably the strongest advocates for authoritarian system in the world today. I think given the length that I've spoken already, I'm going to open up the floor to some questions. Why don't we go ahead and take a few? If they're out there.
If you'll please raise your hand using the reactions button.
And you did something with the picture, so I can't see anybody else on the screen. All I see is myself. Oh, I guess that, there we go. Now I see you, Karen.
I think anybody that raises their hand should appear in the upper left-hand corner of the screen. Is that correct, Beth?
Okay, well, I see somebody up there, Jan.
Excuse me. Thank you so much for that talk. That was stimulating and a little scary, I have to say. But my question for you is, how do we move? What would be a good first start to start addressing some of our flawed democracy in our country as League of Women Voters?
Well, I often answer tough domestic questions by responding, well, my career was in international affairs and that's where I focus. But no, yours is a very relevant subject because particularly when you're talking about democracy and American support for democracy, we have to be able to talk about our own. And right now, as I mentioned earlier, we are facing a number of problems. I don't think we've done a very good job of educating the American public about what is necessary in a functioning democracy, and the partisan nature of the media that we have today has taken advantage of that in order to present many Americans with a biased version of what constitutes the right kind of America, their version, whether it's left, right, or whatever. And so finding ways to better educate Americans, particularly younger Americans. I grew up in the 60s and folks of my generation, of course, were extremely politically active. And there is still some of that and still a fair amount of that today, but trying to reactivate that kind of attitude among young people to take an interest in their country and the affairs of their country, but first to understand how it works. What is the system? How does the system function? What are the checks and balances that we have in our system, and why are they there? And how do we use them to ensure that we retain the fundamental elements of a strong democracy? When people talk about censoring information, for example, or about imposing barriers on voting, those are the kinds of things which, if you take a certain perspective on this country, may sound pretty good, but are antithetical to a functioning democracy. So I would say educating, maybe starting with young people, but the American public certainly in general.
Jean? Jean, you're on mute.
There we go. I was the oldest child in my family, and I resented, I have to say, growing up being told all over and over again that I had to set a good example. But I did indeed take that to heart later on. And I think that before we work very hard trying to set an example for the rest of the world and trying to tell them how to have a good democracy, that we need to get ourselves in order. And that's a good deal of what our speaker just mentioned, but I'm not sure how we go about doing that. I think we talk about democracy, but what we're really talking about is the ideal system that we have that we don't ever really follow through on, but it's a democratic republic. We, as citizens, learn all we can about the people that we want to have be in office so that they can truly represent us. And that is a Republican form of democracy. But I don't know that people really understand how important it is to learn as much as you can about who represents you at every level, not just the presidency, but also your local dog catcher.
Good.
No, that's very, very true. Sometimes it's quite shocking in some political races, the limited information voters have, or the biased nature of the information that they have. And elections, of course, are always susceptible to the prejudices of the time and how people see our societies. And that presents a filter of sorts in terms of the information that comes to them. But the first point that you mentioned in terms of presenting a good example, I would say we always have to do that. There is no way we're ever going to be as successful as we want to be when it comes to promoting democracy, however we may do it, if we can't present a viable example of a functioning democracy ourselves. And today, people would be fair to question the kind of example that America presents for democracy. If it were Sweden or Denmark or the Netherlands, you'd probably say, okay, it's a better example. But of course, we are who we are. We're not going to change that. We're a far more complicated country, far more complex, or larger, more diverse. We have so many other aspects to our country than these albeit laudable democracies, but they're small. If you look at the top 25 democracies in the world today, by far the US is the largest, by far. I can't remember. I think the next closest is a country for like 25 or 30 million. So this is a unique challenge that the United States has. And we're going through a tough patch right now, no question about it. But we have to remind ourselves that the best way to promote democracy is be a good model for it ourselves.
Shelley, thank you. Yeah, Shelley.
Yes, ma'am. Shelley Roars with the League of Women Voters for the Pikes Peak region. Thank you so much for being here with us. Besides the civics education materials that one of our local leagues has been working on and getting together, what other resources would you recommend that can help us educate, Americans regarding how the system works? Is there anything out there that you can give us?
I'm not an educator. You should be talking to my wife, who for many years taught in elementary school and taught these sorts of classes.
That'll work too, no problem.
Yeah, she had all sorts of references that she used, and she taught overseas too. But some of the basic documents in America's founding. I mean, a lot of people want to rely on authentic sources, and there's nothing more authentic than things like whether it's the Declaration of Independence or the Constitution. I always carried with me a very sort of pocket version of the U.S. Constitution whenever I go to talk to groups when I was overseas. Well, I don't care where I was, whether I was in Nicaragua, whether I was in Portugal or in the Middle East. And when people would ask, well, how does your Constitution deal with X, Y, or Z? I'd take out my nifty little pamphlet. And by the way, we have one of the world's shortest constitutions. Some of the worst democracies have some of the longest constitutions. And I would refer to it and say, well, this is how we do it. And it doesn't provide a lot of guidance sometimes. And it's a reflection of the type of democracy that we have. It provides a system for solving problems. It doesn't solve your problems. And that's probably one of the most important things. But Democracy in America by de Tocqueville. It is a wonderful book. I've read it. I've referred to it multiple times. I quote from it in my class and in my classes. I think it's just an excellent book. It was written, 150 years ago or something like that, but it's still very relevant today about democracy in our country and how we conduct democracy. And so some of those historical references can be enormously valuable because sometimes I think Americans attach more credibility to historic resources. They seem to think they're more authentic. And of course, there's nothing more authentic than the US Constitution, but others written in the 18th and 19th century. I wish I could tell you more, but I really don't teach democracy, so I can't cite, a whole lot of sources.
Thanks, sir.
Kathy.
I am troubled, but understand why you call democracy here a flawed democracy in the US. I also know that organizations at any size need change. I'm wondering if you see these calls for expanding the Supreme Court or ending the filibuster as short-term solutions or something that should be seriously considered?
Again, that's very much a domestic political question. I don't necessarily think that having a larger Supreme Court or keeping or doing away with the filibuster is democratic or anti-democratic. If it works within the system and it keeps the democracy healthy and functioning, it certainly ought to be considered. That's one of the characteristics of a functioning democracy, is that it provides the flexibility that society needs to govern itself as times change. And times have most definitely changed in our country, well, certainly since our founding, but even in the last 10 to 20 years. And so those sorts of tweaks, I don't necessarily, and I know they're very significant politically, so I'm not trying to denigrate them. They may not necessarily impact our democracy in a favorable or unfavorable way. It's how we use those. And if they're used for very partisan reasons, chances are it's not going to be healthy. If they're used in a way that our system was intended to be used, and that is to advance the greater interest of the public, then it's a good thing.
Thank you.
Barb. You need to unmute.
Thank you. Now, I guess I'm struggling with how we work with the solution to immigration. And I just wondered if your thoughts, or if you had any observations or lessons learned from other countries on how we could go about best dealing with the challenges we have.
Frankly, up until very recently, we were the model. The United States was known as the country that took in immigrants from all over the world, and as a result prospered. And personally, I still believe that that's a model that works for our country. I was just reading something very recently that 44 of the top 100 corporations in America are being led by immigrants. And many new businesses, a significant number of new businesses are established by immigrants. So immigrants historically have been an engine for the American economy, and we should all applaud that. It's good for our economy, but the countries of Europe historically have not done well with immigration. France, even the Scandinavian countries, Germany thought it was doing a good thing back in the mid 2000s in terms of its dealing with immigrants from the Middle East and Afghanistan, and it backfired on them. We saw similar reactions in places like Hungary and Poland, although the Poles have done a remarkable job of embracing refugees from Ukraine, which raises another question. So there aren't a lot of good models. The four countries, I would say, that over the course of a period of a long time have done well, not perfectly by any stretch, and in dealing with immigration have been the United States, Canada, Australia, and Great Britain. But I will also say that you got to read the fine print in each one of those countries, because they all have serious flaws, and we are obviously confronting some of those ourselves. There is no model out there that has worked for any single country. I was surprised to see some of the backlash being experienced in Denmark, for example. You wouldn't expect that in a fairly tolerant and open society like Denmark.
Okay, thank you.
Eve.
Yes, thank you. And thank you for your words of experience and knowledge. My question is, what modalities have you seen as being effective in helping to educate others and to being more sensitive to diversity without creating fear of loss of power. Because too often specific populations must know their place to be accepted. And unfortunately, our last administration did reinforce this.
I think that was Eve that was speaking, correct?
Yes.
Yeah,
Yeah. I think that really points to the comment that I made about understanding the culture, the history, the language, the religion, and so forth of societies as we try to promote democracy, but also in addressing the issue of diversity. You have to be able to work within the culture and the history that exists there. Early on in my career, I was very enthusiastic in some of the things that I was working on, and the ambassador for whom I was working had a great deal of experience, and he would often tell me, just remember, it's not your country. And as much as we would like to see not only our own country, but other countries do the right thing, in the end, it's not our country. And understanding it's not your country and that it comes from a different historical and human experience is vitally important. And therefore, approaching something as difficult as diversity is really going to be challenging. For example, you will find in general, countries with exposure to the sea tend to be more open and tolerant. Countries that are insular and less exposure to the sea are less so. And the best example I can give for that is my experience in Oman. Oman is on the Arabian Peninsula, a part of the world that's not open, that is generally not seen as being open and tolerant. But in the case of Oman, it had a very, very different history because it's a coastal country. It has a coastline not quite as long as California's, but it's still pretty long, and has a long history of exposure to Africa, South Asia, and even East Asia as sailors and traders. And as a result, they are remarkably tolerant for being an Arabian Peninsula country, a very conservative Muslim country. They welcomed and accepted, for example, Christian churches, Hindu temples. They allowed freedom of worship. They didn't accept proselytizing, but had no problems with people freely worshiping. They had no problems with visitors coming from all over the world to their country. In fact, they welcomed them. They actively took advantage of their tolerance to promote tourism. And that's the kind of country where talking about diversity is relatively easier because of their history. In Saudi Arabia, where I also served, it was really tough. On the other hand, I will also say Saudi Arabia has something really unique that no other country in the world has, and that is the annual Hajj. That is when it's a time of year when Muslims from all over the world go to Mecca to celebrate a Muslim holiday for an entire week. And they truly come from all over the world. Pre-COVID, you'd see as many as 3 or 4 million. It's declined significantly as a result of COVID. 4 million people, half of those are Saudis or people or countries very close to Saudi Arabia, and come and mix. And as a result, you could find Saudis, when it comes to racial tolerance, being fairly open. Religious tolerance, not so much. And certainly when it comes to respecting certain rights as we see them of women, not very much either. But racially, I'd say they weren't bad. They were pretty good, in fact. You didn't see any kind of the racial violence that we see in our country, for example. And so understanding the culture, the history, the language, and so forth can be vitally important. And if I can just bang the drum of the Foreign Service, this is why it's so critically important to have a core of diplomats who are specifically trained in the languages and the cultures of the countries where they serve, and therefore are able to modulate their message according to the language and the culture of those countries, and in the language of those countries too, which is extremely important. Working through an interpreter, yes, you can do that. These days, you can even use Google Translate. I'm using that now in the country where I am. Very embarrassingly and ineffectively most of the time, I will say. But the most effective way is to speak the language of the country where you are. And having those people who can do that really helps you broaden your message, because you can connect so much more easily when you speak in the language of the country. And that's, of course, what we do try to do when we train our foreign service officers to serve around the world. But understanding the role of language and culture, history, and so forth is so vitally important.
Excellent point. Deb.
Mr. Ambassador, thank you for being here with us today. Towards the conclusion of your comments, you mentioned that there are systems being promoted in the US that you find troubling, and I'm wondering if you could describe which of those systems you find particularly worrisome.
These are the ones that, even though they're advertised differently, that may have the ultimate effect of limiting the ability of citizens to vote and participate in elections in the way we would hope every citizen would participate. And we're seeing an increase in this. And I've seen this in other countries, by the way. I've seen authoritarians in other countries use the power of the office that they have in order to skew the system. When I served in Nicaragua during the middle 1980s, the president then is unfortunately the president today, Daniel Ortega. He was an authoritarian then. He's even a worse authoritarian today. And he used his system to advance his own party, political party, and individuals within his party. And he used the power of the purse of the state in order to sort of screen those who could take advantage of the system and of the state in general. So, for example, if you, now we haven't gone to this extent in this country, but if you did not subscribe to the particular party line of Daniel Ortega at that time, you would not be allowed to, well, you would be limited in the certain scarce goods that you could purchase in stores, that your allowance might be cut as a result. And this is a way that the more flagrant systems can manipulate their power in order to remain in power. And I think in some cases today, we are seeing not something so overt, but ways to prevent citizens from exercising their right to vote, which ought to be something that is the antithesis of our democratic system. That every citizen, I don't care how you intend to vote, you should have the right to vote and should be able to vote easily.
Ambassador, there's a question in the chat, and Jan, if I mangle this, please speak up. The question is, does immigration improve because a geographically larger country has the ability to be able to absorb immigrants? Is that an accurate representation, Jan?
Yes, thank you very much.
Okay.
It just seemed like the countries you mentioned were geographically fairly large, and I would think the smaller countries would have more difficulty absorbing immigrants and not displacing, let's say, the people who work and make money in that country?
There's no question of that. The bigger the country you are, and I'm not talking just the geographic size, but also the economy, the better suited the country will be to absorb immigrants. And that's why the United States is still seen as the chief country for receiving immigrants, because we have the kind of economy that easily absorbs immigrants, particularly given the behavior of immigrants in general throughout our history. They tend to be very strong workers. I mean, all of my grandparents were immigrants, and that probably would apply to many people in this call. But even today, for example, the immigrants that we see coming from Mexico, Central America, and elsewhere in Latin America, and even further afield, places like India and so forth, tend to do extremely well in this country because the economic opportunity is there, the size, the capacity for absorption. And I think this is one of the challenges that places still large economies, but not as large as ours, came up against. The other advantage that we have is we are a very diverse country already. Racially, ethnically, religiously, countries in Europe are less that way. They are becoming more so, but that's a challenge for them when the country that is overwhelmingly dominated by certain ethnicity, and now you have new ethnic groups coming in, say from the Middle East, completely different languages, different religions, and so forth. Very often the natural human impulse is to pull back because you don't understand them. They speak a language you don't speak. They practice cultural ways that are not yours. And this is where some cultural awareness can go a long way toward allowing people to accept immigrants. I will just briefly, I know we're going over the time here, but if we have more time, I'm happy to go on. I was in a pharmacy in Denver, and I noticed that the woman on the other side who was working on my order had an Arabic name, and so I started speaking to her in Arabic, and she was really quite taken aback. I want to say she was speechless. And so I said, okay, my Arabic's probably a little rusty, but it's not that bad. And she said, and she leaned over and spoke to me in English. She said, no, you're in fact, I was shocked you spoke Arabic because I don't hear any Americans speak it, but I'm a little afraid to speak my language. And I felt bad when I heard that. I felt really bad. She had been in our country for 5 years. She had her green card. She had gotten her pharmacy degree overseas. She was from Iraq, as a matter of fact. She gotten a degree in pharmacy overseas, and now she was doing all the things she had to do to get her certifications here. But she shared with me some of the problems that she and her children had faced because they were Arabs in this country. And so thankfully, there was no one standing behind me in the line. So I said, you know, America seems to go through these paroxysms of racism and ethnic hatred. They did it against my grandparents and so many other ethnic groups who immigrated to this country, whether it's Irish, Poles, Germans, Vietnamese, Chinese, Japanese, Filipinos, you name the group, and they have experienced this really repulsive racism of some form or another in our country. But eventually our country has gotten over many of those. We're still struggling with some of them, particularly racism as it applies to Blacks and Asians. And I just said, rely on your own culture, never be ashamed of it. And please make sure that you teach your children your language, as well as the language of your new country. And she was reassured to hear that. But I said, you know, from time to time, you're going to experience this. I'm sorry, it exists in this country. But the more people see you and your family for who you are, for what you do, what you contribute, the less that will be a factor. And typically speaking, in our country, that has been the case. As all of these immigrants come to this country, they are absorbed into our country, they do well, they're successful, they work hard, they contribute, they serve in our armed forces, they vote, they're active, they're represented in all aspects of our public life and so forth. They end up being accepted. We're still dealing with some vestiges of the old problems, but I think the arc of history proves that in general, people will accept others regardless or irrespective of their race or religion, despite the challenges we have in getting there.
I think it's quite interesting that many of our politicians tout the message that, oh, immigrants simply come to our country and then take advantage of our system and are a drain on our economy and use up all of our, you know, support resources. And yeah, to your comment that many new businesses are established by immigrants, and what hard workers immigrants are. So the narrative that we get from politicians is certainly a lot different than the facts on the ground, which is unfortunate that we don't get more publicity on that part of it. Kira.
There was a study, I wish I could remember, it was either Brookings or the Atlantic Council that did a long-term study of the contribution of Mexican immigrants to the United States. And it's really impressive in terms, if you're just looking strictly economic contribution, the contribution of Mexican immigrants to this country have made, it's enormous, enormous. We are better off for what they have done.
We just need to publicize that a bit more, huh? Karen.
Absolutely.
Yes, when you were talking about educating our Foreign Service officers, it made me wonder whether the Peace Corps contributes people to the Foreign Service, and we don't hear much about the Peace Corps anymore. I'm wondering if that needs to be more emphasized by, funding by Congress and so forth. If you see it as a worthwhile effort.
The Peace Corps is an independent agency of the federal government. It's not part of the State Department. They're not connected in any way, shape, or form to the State Department. And Peace Corps volunteers do not get involved in democracy promotion programs. They're mostly looking at addressing more fundamental needs of populations around the world, health, nutrition, agriculture, economic development, things of that nature. And of course, they all are volunteers. However, I will say that many volunteers graduate from the Peace Corps and come into the Foreign Service. It used to be up through about the period of the Vietnam War. The majority of, in terms of general groupings of Foreign Service officers came from the military. That is, they served in the military for a brief period of time and then came into the Foreign Service. That's no longer the case. I think Peace Corps probably is the single largest contributor of Foreign Service officers in terms of government organizations, and the military now is probably a distant second or third, I would think. I don't really know. And so a number of my colleagues were former volunteers.
We have time for one last question. Is there anybody else that has something that they would like to ask? Anna. You're on mute. There you go. Anna, you need to unmute yourself.
Okay, am I on now? Okay.
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, as a former Peace Corps volunteer back in the long ago past, I feel that the Peace Corps was a really good experience for experiencing people in another country as they are. not just going as a tourist, not even going as a diplomat. Because in the Peace Corps, you actually went out into different villages and things like that. And I do know a lot of Peace Corps volunteers who live here in Colorado, and they are all involved in some type of service occupation. And at one time, and maybe I misunderstood this, Peace Corps volunteers were not allowed to go into government service for fear that the people that we were working with would think that we were spies. Maybe that's not true. Please help me out on that.
Well, it's certainly what I mean, as a former volunteer, I mean, you know, yeah, volunteers have a very different experience living and working in the countries where they serve than pretty much anyone else, and even diplomats, because they live among the people. I mean, I would too as a diplomat, but I worked in the U.S. Embassy, and everybody knew who I was, and I was always identified as an American diplomat, and that really changes everything. And volunteers are a very different category. I'm not aware of any restriction on further government service for volunteers other than the CIA or intelligence in general. There is a period of time after their service in the Peace Corps during which they cannot join the CIA, period. I don't know whether it's 5 years or something like that. Later on, if they choose to go into the agency, they can. Of course, they can't go back to a country where they served as a volunteer. That's a given. But in terms of the State Department, I definitely know folks who have transitioned fairly quickly. From the Peace Corps into the Foreign Service, they took the exam while they were still while they were still serving in the Peace Corps. They passed the exam, went through the additional steps in order to enter the Foreign Service, and then move fairly quickly into the Foreign Service. And there was no problem in doing that. Typically, the State Department will not assign a volunteer back to a country where they may have served previously. It just doesn't make sense. Same way that an immigrant who may come into the Foreign Service will not be assigned to country from which that person immigrated. Just presents all kinds of complications. It's best not to do those kinds of things.
Well, thank you, Mr. Ambassador. This has been a really illuminating presentation, a pretty sobering one as well. I think I have to say, I can only speak for myself, that to hear that the US is now considered a flawed democracy is pretty heartbreaking. Perhaps in the near future, you might be willing to come back and visit with us again. You know, I think sometimes it's really easy to make statements that, you know, we've got lots of problems. I think probably many of us know what a lot of those are. We're not so good at coming up with the ways that we need to address them. And if you have additional ideas about that, I think I can speak for everybody in this Zoom meeting today that we would love to have you come back and share some of your ideas, because you've got a very willing, active group of people here that are passionate about defending democracy in this country. And if you've got ideas for how we might do a better job of doing that, I think we'd be all ears. So.
Well, thank you very much for your kind comments, Karen. I've spoken to League of Women Voters previously. I enjoy speaking to them because I'm pretty much preaching to the choir when it comes to democracy. And so it's been a pleasure to meet with all of you and share my observations about democracy and the challenges that we face. And yeah, I'd love to come back sometime and chat a little bit more. I will say, however, again, my expertise is more overseas than working at home, although the challenges at home are every bit as grave, if not more so, than the ones perhaps we face overseas today. I am going to apologize. I was hoping maybe to touch a little bit on Ukraine. So perhaps sometime in the future we could talk a little bit about that, because that's a good sort of a capsule version of the challenges that democracy is facing today, what is going on in Ukraine. And so perhaps at some point, we might be able to talk about that.
Absolutely. But we would love to have you come. We would love to have you come and talk about a number of different things. So I suspect you will be hearing from us again soon. So thank you again for your time today and your thoughtful presentation.
Thank you very much. It's been good to be with you all.
Great.
Have a good weekend.
You too. I am going to now circle back to find out if we have a quorum. We need to have 15 delegates as well as 7 local leagues that are represented. And so Irene, do we have a quorum?
Unmuted. Hi, Karen, can you hear me?
I can.
I can't see you on the video, so.
I don't know what happened.
I can't see myself either, so I'm just.
Yeah, something went strange on the,
There, we're back. There, we're back.
Thanks, Debbie. Go ahead.
I'm sitting with Laura. Hi, guys. Thanks for the extra time was helpful. People kind of jump in and jump out of this meeting. But yes, altogether, we have 54 voting delegates this morning, 9 state board delegates, 45 local league delegates, with 16 local leagues being represented. And on top of that, those are the numbers that we need for the meeting. But on top of that, we have 27 observers.
Okay, so we are good to go then. What I'm going to do now is to just give us a little bit of a break. And so I'd like for us to come back at 10:40, if you will. That gives you, well, let's see. Yeah, that gives you a little bit of time to be able to make a pit stop or get something to drink or whatever. So we will begin again promptly at 10:40.
What's going on? Going on.
Beth Hendricks. Beth?
Yes, Jeanette.
Hi, I need to talk to you about the national convention, and I want to know what's the best time for us to connect.
Pretty much any time after this meeting is over.
Oh, okay, so I will connect with you. What's the best way? On phone, cell, or?
I am putting my, well, you have my email, but
Yeah.
I'm putting my cell in the chat box for everyone to see.
Okay, and I'll call you. I have a bunch of things I have to do this afternoon, but that's one of the top priorities. And I wasn't going to call you before this meeting.
Appreciate that. Thank you.
Since Jeanette has asked a question about convention, I think we need to make a plan for the delegates to talk together.
Oh, that's a good idea.
And I would like to know who's going to be in charge of doing that.
I will be in charge of pulling the meeting together. And I would like to do it just within a week of convention starting.
Okay.
So it'll be fresh in everyone's minds.
Okay.
Any disagreements there?
I don't think so. If I run across something that needs a farther time frame, I'll let you know.
Great. Great.
All right, it is now 10:40. And so I would like to welcome everybody back. It's now time to vote on the items that were presented yesterday. The organizational budget for the next fiscal year, the proposed changes to the bylaws, additions or changes to our positions for action, and of course, the slate of board candidates. I'd like to begin first with the budget, and that will be presented by our board treasurer, Bonnie Seals. Bonnie.
Hi, I would like to, by direction of the Budget Committee, I would like to move for the adoption of the LWV Colorado budget for the fiscal year 2022-2023 as presented in the annual meeting workbook.
Because this is coming from a committee, no second is needed. Are there any questions or clarifications that anybody might like to ask? Okay, I don't see any hands or any R's in the chat box. So the question before the annual meeting is the approval of LWVCO budget for the fiscal year 2022-23 is printed on pages 25 through 27 of the workbook. Beth has just launched a voting poll. If you will cast your vote and then submit it, please.
Five more seconds to vote.
Margie's not seeing the poll, Beth.
Margie, I don't know what to tell you. You might want to leave and come back. Or make sure you're not logged in as me, which happens a lot. But we are getting a lot of voting here, so this is not widespread. try again, Eve, as well. See if maybe you can.
I see I'm logged in with my League of Women Voters, Chaffey County, rather than myself. So it's probably, that's it.
Okay.
You know, I changed my name, so I didn't log in as myself. So maybe I can do that or not.
Okay.
Okay. All right.
The motion did pass. The budget for fiscal year 23 has been adopted. Please close the poll.
100% as well. So Beth, would you like to just very quickly screen share the Leader of Democracy teaser? Beth's been busy working on this.
Hold on. Sorry.
The state of democracy has never been more fragile in our state, our country, and our world. I'm Joanne Allen. Please join me on June 1st when I host the Leader of Democracy online event. We will celebrate the League of Women Voters Colorado's victories and recognize 2 honorees who are fighting for our principles. Gitanjali Rao was Time's Kid of the Year, an inspirational young leader who is creating global change by mobilizing teens around science. And Tony Larson, a legendary leader who has strengthened the democratic, higher education, and nonprofit systems in Colorado. Save your spot online today at lwvcolorado.org.
Thanks, Beth. Looks like the Leader of Democracy event will be a great event again this year. And of course, we are going to be recognizing Tony, who has over 50 years of service to the League. I hope that you will mark your calendar now and plan to join in for this virtual celebration on June the 1st. So let's now move on to the proposed changes to our state bylaws. They were presented last night by our board secretary, Irene Tynes. Because again, this is coming from a committee, no second is needed. Are there any questions or clarifications or any suggested changes to our bylaws from the floor? Irene?
I'm not seeing anything. And I didn't get any, I got 1 or 2 emails last night.
Okay.
Answered their questions.
Great. All right, would you please then make a motion for approval of these bylaws changes?
By direction of the Bylaws Committee, I move for the adoption of the bylaws changes as presented in the annual meeting.
All right, the question before the annual meeting is the approval of the LWVCO bylaws changes beginning on page 31 through 38 of the workbook. Beth will be putting out the poll. Do you approve the bylaws changes as presented? Please vote now.
Five more seconds. The motion passed. The proposed changes to the bylaws are adopted. Please close your polls.
And again, that was by 100%. Thank you. Now we'll vote on the LWVCO proposed program for 2022-23. Barb.
Okay, I didn't receive any questions either, and I don't see any in the chat box. So by direction of the program committee, I move for the adoption of the League of Women Voters Colorado proposed program for 2022-23 as presented in the annual meeting workbook.
Again, because this is coming from a committee, no second is needed. Are there any questions or clarifications? I see no hands up. So the question before the annual meeting is the approval of the League of Women Voters of Colorado program for 2022-23 as printed on pages 29 through 30 of the workbook. Do you approve of the LWV of Colorado proposed program for 2022-2023 as printed?
Five more seconds. The motion passed. The program for fiscal year 23 has been adopted. Please close your polls.
And again, that was by 100%. We're on a roll, guys.
Yes.
Last night, Connie Fox presented the slate of candidates for the board of directors as recruited by the nominating committee. Are there any nominations from the floor? Again, please remember that if you are nominating a person from the floor, they must have consented prior to being nominated. All right, I see no one stepping forward. So the nominations are now closed. Connie, would you make a motion, please?
I move that the secretary cast a unanimous ballot for the slate as presented.
No second is needed for this motion, again, because it comes from a committee. The question before the annual meeting is whether the secretary cast a unanimous ballot for the slate as presented by the nominating committee. So let's take a poll vote. Shall the secretary cast a unanimous vote for the slate as presented by the nominating committee? Please vote.
Assuming choice 1 is yes.
That's
Yes.
right.
Apologies for that. Choice 1 is yes. Choice 2 is no.
Which choice?
5 more seconds. The motion passed. We have a new board of directors. Congratulations.
And again, that was by 100% vote. So thank you so much. And again, thanks to the nominating committee. Because last year we elected 3 non-board members, Connie Fox, LWV Montezuma, Margie Gray, LWV Chaffee County, and Vicki McLean, LWV Larimer, to serve on the nominating committee for 2-year terms. We do not need to elect any more nominating committee members this year. Connie, Margie, and Vicki, we thank you for your continuing service. Bylaws do state that the committee is made up of 5 people. 3 are non-board members, and then 2 board members. I'm happy to announce that Lena Brown, who is currently a member of the state board and member of the Arapahoe Douglas chapter, has agreed to chair the nominating committee this year. The board will now appoint the 2nd member at our first board meeting with our newly seated directors and officers. And as always, a board briefings will be sent out to all members following that meeting, and we'll report who the board appointed to this most important committee. As always, we are looking for potential candidates. The nominating committee now functions year-round, and one of their areas of focus, in addition to providing us each year with a slate of candidates for board of directors, is to seek out individuals that we can have available to tap if so needed, for a variety of different purposes, and to make it a little bit easier when it comes time in the early spring to begin searching for new board candidates. So if you are interested, or if you know of somebody that you think would be a great potential candidate, then please contact Lena Brown, or actually any of those nominating committee members. Before we go any further, I would like to focus on outgoing board members who I have to tell you deserve a lot of recognition for the work that they have done this year and in past years working on the board. Dr. Connie Fox has served as the LWVCO chair of the nominating committee. She served on the board. I am sure that you all will agree that she, along with the rest of that committee, really did a bang-up job bringing a great slate of candidates for your consideration this year. Connie has decided to step off of the board at this time so that she can focus more attention on doing things at her local chapter level. She is involved with the Montezuma County League as SMI, and I will tell you, Connie's got great ideas and she's wonderful to work with. So I'm really looking forward to working with her in that capacity. Dr. Beth Malmskog has served 2 years on the board. She was very instrumental in our redistricting work. Her mathematical genius and that of her students as well informed league membership as well as the general public about the math behind redistricting. And I believe that her insight has led to the betterment of data processes that will help with redistricting in 2031 and beyond. And in addition, I have to say, as somebody who really is not as math oriented as I probably should be, that Beth has a real gift for making complicated mathematical processes understandable. If you had time to sit in on a presentation she made on redistricting, then you know what I'm trying to say. I think that's quite a legacy. She is highly deserving of the sabbatical on which she is about to embark. She did recently gain tenure, which is quite a milestone. And we are looking forward to welcoming her back into the league fold when she returns to Colorado College at the end of her sabbatical. And of course, last but certainly not least, we are recognizing the incredible service of Tony Larson as she finishes her term on the board. I don't think that I probably need to tell any of you how much of an impact Tony has made on the league and on Colorado over the 50+ years that she has been a member of the league. Tony has served as president at the local and state levels. She also served as a member of the LWVUS board. As director of action and advocacy, she has guided our advocacy efforts. And we have become increasingly more proactive and visible. She's a professional lobbyist who has supported higher education. She's actually authored a book called Public Policy in Higher Education, so she is a published author. She's a founding member of the Board of Colorado Nonprofits Association, which supports thousands of organizations providing vital services throughout our state. It's amazing how much nonprofits contribute and fill in the gaps where government is not able to do so. And to tell you more about Tony's service, here's former Secretary of State, Bernie Busher.
Hi, this is Bernie Busher, and I am delighted that the League of Women Voters is honoring Tony Larson with its Leader of Democracy Award. It is so fitting that you are honoring Tony. She's done extraordinary work, not just for the League, but for the citizens of Colorado. I particularly admire the work that she did helping us put into place the redistricting reform in Colorado, which has served as a model for the entire country. Her leadership and her wisdom and her hard work on that important project really has changed the way that our state functions and has been a great gift. Congratulations, Tony. I'm delighted to have had the opportunity to work with you, and I hope we get many more chances. Your friend, Bernie Busher.
Well, that's a wonderful endorsement. I would again now like to invite all of you, excuse me, to this year's Leader of Democracy Awards celebration. It is an online event on June the 1st. It starts at 6 o'clock. Again, we will be honoring Tony, and we'll hopefully at that time give her a little bit of her due. I also would like to remind you that this is LWVCO's major annual fundraiser. You can register for this free event on the website, and Beth will be putting the registration site in the chat box. So we hope that you have marked it on your calendar, and we hope that we'll see you there. Now, I would like to introduce one of our new board members, Maud Naral, who will take a few minutes to talk about plans for the Legislative Action Committee. Maud.
Thank you, Karen. Under Tony and Andrea Wilkins' watch, the Legislative Action Committee has been awesome. This session, we provided testimony on dozens of bills, but we could still use more help. We meet virtually. The legislature is taking testimony virtually, and so we're looking for members bringing their input and their perspectives from all across the state. We will train and mentor new members. We could use more people on education. I'm sure there are other people besides Karen in this group who have been at one point or another an educator, or have loved a teacher, or have been taught by a teacher. We could use more people on healthcare. We've had bills introduced on that, reproductive rights, immigration, gun safety, and children. I'm sure all of us have loved a child or two or three or more at one point or another in our lives, or been a child, but we currently have no one following policies for children or childcare, or really the rest of Health and Human Services. And then all of these items need funding, and we could use help covering tax policy. Again, I covered that one, but I had 70 bills in my spreadsheet, so I could use somebody to pick up maybe at least one of the bills. I'm happy to train. Kathy, did you put your email in the chat?
I put it in earlier.
Yeah, if you could put Kathy as Kathy and I are partnering on this. And she's the best person to contact, but also you can contact me. It's maudlwv@gmail.com, or you can contact the main office. And I'd like half a second to point out that if anybody is a delegate or knows anyone who is a delegate, please support the election security position that this group, the State League, helped develop and approved at the state level, that we've used already this last session, that we want to be adopted by concurrence at national. And we have links to all of our documents and some more. If anybody missed our presentations, we have more presentations starting this afternoon coming up. So I just put the link in our chat, including our schedule. So thank you.
Thanks, Maud.
Come join us.
And just to second Maud's invitation, we really need people from across the state. I suspect probably that there's a real heavy concentration of LWC members that kind of live in the Denver greater metropolitan area, which is wonderful. But the truth is that our perspectives differ sometimes depending upon where in the state we live. And so it's really, really important to get those to get those perspectives as league members are looking at legislation and vetting it and trying to decide what position the league will take. So especially if you live in a more rural area or somewhere away from a larger metropolitan area or metropolitan area outside of Denver, please consider joining. I know that both Maud and Kathy and Andrea have been really doing some brainstorming to discuss ways that they can make participation in this committee a little less time intensive, so that people don't feel that they can't participate because they don't have the time. So you've got their emails, and I hope you all step up and take the challenge of participating. We're now going to take about 15 minutes for delegates to provide direction to the new board. If you are interested in sharing, please type an R in the chat box, or if you'd like to just raise your hand. I think that works really well during the ambassador's presentation. We ask that once you have provided your direction verbally, that you also submit it in writing via the chat box so that our secretary can properly record your suggestion. I do want you to know that the board takes your directions to heart, and we will share that at our first new board meeting, and do our very best to act on some of those things. So I know that Linda Hutchinson has some things that she would like to share, so I'm going to let her take the floor and kick off this discussion. Linda? Is she here today?
Just so that they can see.
There she is.
She's with the big group.
Step back just a step back a little bit. There, we can see you now.
Okay. Okay, so do we have a slide, or should I just read my paper?
There.
Okay. I'm Linda Hutchinson, and I'm representing the League of Women Voters of Larimer County and the Colorado League of Women Voters Task Force on News Access and Literacy for Civic Participation. So, okay. Regarding the inclusion of news access and literacy to League of Women Voters Colorado's campaign for making democracy work, whereas the League of Women Voters believes an informed citizenry is integral to democracy, whereas the spread of news deserts throughout the United States negatively impacts LWV principles, positions, and values, whereas LWV previously agreed the issue of news access and literacy was fundamental to the campaign of making democracy work, and you can find that in Impact on Issues 2022, page 18. Whereas the League of Women Voters of Larimer County believes that ensuring news access and literacy is the substrate that will strengthen and broaden our campaign for making democracy work by empowering citizens to fulfill their designated role in the decision-making process. Be it resolved that the League of Women Voters of Larimer County respectfully submits that news access and literacy for civic participation be added to the Colorado League of Women Voters campaign for making democracy work. Thank you.
Thank you, Linda. Do we have any other directions from the floor? Shelley.
Yes, ma'am. We had our annual meeting last month, and one of our members brought up that in one particular area, it's a mostly minority area in the downtown Springs, they would like some more guidance, regarding, and specifically from the league, and maybe having one of our teams look at where voter service boxes are actually located, where the ballot boxes are. The reason given for not having a ballot box in this one particular area is that there is not a camera in that area. And it seems like a pretty weak response not to have. Shit, I can go down and attach a hunting camera down to a tree and have a camera in that area if that solves our problem. Because that's what we're doing with our mural wallscape, because it's been vandalized twice now. So Shelley, about 9 o'clock on one night, is going to be putting a hunting camera up in a tree. But she specifically asked that the state league look at where ballot boxes are. If they aren't in some minority communities, how can we get them there in more prevalent, in more easier access than we keep getting told no, because in this particular case, there's no camera.
That's a great idea, Shelley.
Thank you. Great idea. Yes, thank you.
And with Barb as our new voter service person, I know she will be right on that. So, Jeanette.
I'm Jeanette Scotland from the Denver League, and I have been attending a group of Latinas for several years now, and they are very interested in immigration, and they are one of our partnerships here in the Denver League. And I was very interested in putting together a presentation on immigration. And these, there are 3 Latina attorneys who are more than willing, and they're eager to make a presentation to the Denver and to the State League on immigration issues. So I would propose to the state board, if you could identify a time and place where we could have a statewide presentation on immigration issues, if we could go ahead and do that. I would like to do that, and I would be willing to work to set that up.
Thank you. Thank you. That's a wonderful idea. And I'm wondering too, Beth, just to kind of piggyback on what Jeanette has just said, you know, maybe a different presentation could also talk about all of the ways that immigrants make contributions to our community, so that people have a little better understanding of the contribution that these individuals who come to our country add. I think that gets lost sometimes in our
And I think we just need an update on where we are with improving our immigration system in the United States.
Right.
That's gotten terribly bogged down.
The Latinas community is very discouraged with what has happened with immigration. But I would work with people, the program person on the board to, you know, tailor the presentation to meet what we need to hear at the state level.
Okay.
Great.
This is Irene. I just wanted to respond to that because the ambassador triggered that conversation in his speech. And while he was doing it, I quickly kind of looked up a few things, and just, it's interesting to know that in 2019, the last economic thing that I could find, it's the immigrants bring in $100 billion to their households and are paying $10 billion a year in taxes. And that's just the beginning of it, right? Not to mention that they're doing the work. So I think that this should be a priority. I agree.
So much for the old argument of, oh my gosh, they're just a drain on our system, and
yes,
all of our social service resources.
Yes.
And it should be stated that even the undocumented population, you know, a strong majority of them are paying into Social Security, and they are never going to see that.
So Beth, the number was undocumented.
Oh, that's only undocumented.
That's undocumented.
Wow.
Yep.
So I'll find out the information and send it. Thank you.
Thank you, Irene. That's a good starting point for changing that narrative if we can. Are there any other directions to the board? All right, well, I see no other comments in the chat, and I see no other hands. So at this time, unless there is something else that somebody would like to add, we appreciate your valuable input and your comments. We are so appreciative that so many of you chose to take up a lion's share of your Saturday. We now have 76 participants online to be engaged in our 2022 annual meeting. Beth, do you have anything else you'd like to add?
Nope, just sincere appreciation. Can we give a round of applause to Karen here? I think we can all agree that her tenure has been incredibly successful, and I'm grateful. I will miss you, Karen. I'm so glad you're staying on the board, and I'm thrilled that you're taking local league support, because you're just gonna kick some more butt there. I just know it. So,
well, thank you. It's certainly any successes that I've had have really been the result of lots of great people I've been able to work with. So, and obviously the league's mission is a really important one. So it's always nice to be a part of something that makes a big difference. So, right. Well, in that case, I now am going to adjourn this year's annual meeting. Hope to see you all at National.
take care, everyone.